Much of Odyssey remains a mystery at the moment. We know it will allow players to walk around on planets and in limited parts of space stations. It will also contain light atmospheric planets and of course ground combat too. However, there are a lot of unknowns, so let's take a look at what those are. The Odyssey website mentions the so-called sphere of combat. Here's the exact quote. Experience intense first-person combat. Kit out your character with an array of weapons and gear and coordinate with teammates to master a multi-layered, deep tactical environment where commanders, SRVs and starships converge. So essentially this appears to be what other games call combined arms. How this plays out remains completely unknown. However, Frontier have said there is a dev diary coming out later this month which will be discussing combat. Now, whilst it seems very likely that the game will allow combat to happen dynamically, that is to say players might want to approach a settlement as a group in order to attack it, or alternatively players might want to organise a makeshift PvP war zone. I personally suspect though that Odyssey will offer some form of battleground as a feature. In fact, the recent dev diaries included an area called Frontline Solutions. Now the devs never really went into too much detail on this, but it has been said that frontline support will be a way to access combat scenarios without actually aligning with any faction in the game world. The bottom line here then is a pretty broad unknown. Currently there's virtually no information on how combat will actually play out in Odyssey, but do keep an eye out for Dev Diary 3. It feels as though new ships would be a given for an update as large as Odyssey. Personally, I'd be very surprised if at least 1 or 2 new ships don't make an appearance. The Elite franchise still has a load of ships that haven't been introduced into Elite Dangerous, and as I've been talking, a few of them have appeared on the screen. These are from the prequels, mostly Frontier Elite 2. And I think the Panther Clipper, which we've seen, or suspected we've seen at least in concept art, is a great example of a ship that players have been waiting for years. Odyssey really would be a great time to introduce it. There are of course many more ships. It's also possible that Frontier could introduce entirely new ships as they did with the Chieftain. Just like ships, new SRVs would be a big deal. However, there's no information on this yet. Now, I would actually go as far as arguing that new SRVs will be more important to Odyssey than new ships, simply because most of the update will be taking place on the ground. Old concept art shows a few examples of the type of ground vehicles and ground designs that Frontier have considered in the past. Any of these would make for a great addition. For me, new SRVs are very high on my wish list of things that really should be included in Odyssey. Shortly after Odyssey was announced, Frontier pointed out that ship interiors will not be available in Odyssey at launch. This knocked the wind out of the sails for many people, me included. It's honestly still a surprise to see that such an important feature will be missing. That said, the question of ship interiors recently came up in a Frontier AMA, and this is what they had to say on the subject. We don't have anything to share on ship interiors. We can only confirm that they won't be available for launch. And in a second response they said, we have no update on ship interiors or transitions at this moment in time. And when we have any news or changes, we will update everyone on our social channels. The takeaway here is that Frontier are not outright saying that ship interiors will never be a thing. In fact, they're indicating, or implying at least, that maybe one day they will be in the future. If that's to be the case, it opens up some questions about updates after Odyssey. More on that in just a moment. Atmospheric planets have always been hugely anticipated for Elite. Back in 2014, many people felt atmospheric planets would be no more than a few years away. However, they never actually materialised. Years ago, Frontier always said that new planet types would be rolled out in phases, starting with rocky, atmospheric-less planets first, and those were introduced with Horizons. The next step would have been to add basic atmospheres. Now, Frontier have announced that planets with a tenuous atmosphere would be in Odyssey. The question on any other type of planets beyond that remains open, and when asked if Earth-like worlds would be in Odyssey in an AMA, Frontier responded with the following: "That's unconfirmed as of yet." So it's a really simple response, but one that I find really interesting, as it certainly leaves the door open. So for now, it remains an unknown of just how many planet types Odyssey will ultimately introduce. It's been confirmed that walking around in specific limited areas of space stations would indeed be a thing, and Dev Diary 2 showed some footage of this. This naturally led to questions on the fleet carrier interiors. Will players be able to access any interiors for these huge ships then? Well, the answer to that seems to be entirely unknown. However, Frontier have confirmed that fleet carrier bridges will not be a thing. Asked about fleet carrier bridges, Frontier said there are no plans to add a bridge currently. No bridges then, but maybe carrier interiors. Personally, I'd like to see any dockable location have at least some form of basic interior. After all, that makes complete sense, right? Artificial gravity is a huge deal in any space-based sci-fi. Star Trek deals with it by pseudoscience. Star Wars doesn't even acknowledge it. Elite Dangerous, meanwhile, has only centrifugal gravity on rotating stations. This means outposts and ships have zero gravity when in space, and this raises two unanswered questions for Odyssey. How will gravity work in outposts? These are the smaller stations that don't rotate. Will players then have to have mag boots? And two, what about EVA? Will it be possible for players to leave their ship whilst in space? Old concept art shows that Frontier have at least considered this in the past. I really think it would add a lot if this was possible. Moving on, Frontier haven't answered the question on whether or not there will be a beta, instead opting to simply say they are still considering how to approach all of this. They admit that betas have helped them a lot in the past though. Personally, I suspect that there will be a beta and that it will work similar to the way it did with Horizons. Basically, back then, everyone who pre-ordered Horizons gained access to the Horizons beta test. It would make sense to do something very similar to Odyssey. What comes after the initial release of Odyssey? Well, that is the big question, isn't it? It seems obvious that Frontier will release updates and patches for anything that needs fixing and balancing, so we can certainly expect a few patches after the update releases. But what about the content updates in the future? It's a huge open and unknown question. Based upon what Frontier have said about ship interiors, that they won't be in at release, it seems reasonable to assume that just maybe they will come at a future date. Additionally, the implication that other planet types beyond tenuous atmospheres may be a possibility also points towards future content releases. All of this is pure speculation, of course, but to me at least it feels as though it could well be likely. How such updates would release though, and whether or not they would be included as a part of the Odyssey update, only time will tell. So that pretty much brings us to an end of this video. If there's any unknowns and any things you are really wondering about Odyssey, I'd love to hear from you in the comments section. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.